The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, you ready, Jinghua?
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
started.
All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the SB 743 workshop. OCTA is very excited about holding this workshop. My name is Anoop Kulkarni, Section Manager of the Regional Modeling and Traffic Operations section at OCTA. I will be the host for this workshop, and I'll be handling the slides as well. So I wanted to sincerely thank everybody for attending this workshop. We have had over 100 people register for the event. I'm not sure how many are in right now, but for sure it's a lot of interest and exciting. So again, this is our first foray into kind of a webinar setup, and I'd like to thank Jinghua and Fair and Peers for setting this event up. So welcome. We have a number of exciting and informative speakers. Brian Smoky from OCTA on OCTAM, Ron Millam and Jinghua Zhu from Fair and Peers, who are helping OCTA with our effort to meet some of the SB 743 requirements. Sun Murillo from Irvine, Larry Tay from Orange, David Kennedy from Anaheim, and Scott Shelley from Caltrans to provide an update on their local efforts as well. Again, I want to thank all the presenters for being a part of this event. Please note that other than the presenters, all the participants will be muted. If you do need assistance during the webinar, go ahead and email me. My email contact information is kind of on the screen right now. I will periodically check my emails, and we will record the webinar and make it available along with slides, and we'll figure out how to do that after the event. So the agenda for today starts with Fair and Peers providing an SB 743 introduction as well as an update. Then OCTA will kind of review our efforts to prepare for this change, particularly with respect to OCTAM and VMT tools that we are developing as part of the OCTAM model stream. We'll also get an update on local agency efforts, including Caltrans and the local cities. So the schedule is tight, and I want to make sure that we get through all the presenters. So one thing we are doing is kind of limiting the Q&A to 2 times. The first one is after the Fair and Peers presentation, and at the end, the second one being at the end of the other presentations at the end of the workshop, time permitting. Because the participants are muted during the workshop, we're requesting that questions be submitted via the questions box, and I will read them to the presenters for a response. And if we don't have time to get to them, don't worry, we will compile and send responses to the participants after the workshop, along with the slides and kind of a link to the audio. So with that, I'd like to welcome Ron Millam and Jinghua Zhu from Fair and Peers to kick things off with an SB 743 introduction.
Thank you, Anoop. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jinghua Xu with Fair and Peers. We are currently supporting OCTA on the VMT tool to provide data for SB 743 implementation in Orange County. Before the presentation, I would like to introduce our key presenter, Ron Millam. Some of you may already know him. Ron is one of the Fair and Peers SB 743 technical leaders. He has an extensive background in travel forecasting, transportation impact analysis for CEQA and NEPA, and GHG and VMT analysis. He teaches SB 743 implementation courses for UC Berkeley Tech Transfer and UC Davis Extension. His recent work has included SB 743 implementation projects and VMT forecasting tool development throughout California. Ron served as principal in charge for several local efforts, including implementation efforts for WCOG, SBCTA, San Diego County, and most recently, the Orange County collaborative effort of 7 Orange County cities. Ron, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jinghua. Welcome everyone. This will be a very high-level introduction to implementation of 743. There's definitely more details that we could be covering, but just don't have time for. For those of you that are interested in expanding your knowledge, though, the courses that Jinghua mentioned at UC Berkeley and UC Davis are available through their extension programs, where there's 1- and 2-day course offerings that go much deeper into the subject matter. With that, we'll go to the next slide, Anoop. We want to start with expectations for lead agencies. And to be clear, under the California Environmental Quality Act, the different types of agency roles that public agencies may find themselves in, with the main focus being on lead agencies, because they're the ones that have to implement 743, and they're the ones making decisions about methodology and thresholds and mitigation. So let's start with a broad overview here of the basic roles. Lead agency is one of them. Many of you may also serve as responsible agencies for some projects. Caltrans is in that role commonly when they have responsibility for part of an approval for a project, such as an encroachment permit for access to the state highway. And then all public agencies can be commenting agencies, where they provide comments, either verbal or written, as part of the CEQA process on a project. What we're going to focus on today is really that lead agency role, because they're the ones, again, having to make these individual decisions about how they're going to implement 743. But we do also want to make sure we're being thoughtful about the different relationships of public agencies within Orange County, and specifically with relationship to OCTA. As a transportation authority for the county, they serve such a central role in many of the transportation planning and decision-making aspects of the county's transportation system. As such, they've taken on this SB 743 implementation project really to provide information to help inform the decision-making that each lead agency has to make. There's obviously coordination here with the member agencies. I'll refer to those as local agencies, but Caltrans as well, and we'll be hearing from Caltrans a little later in the presentation. Let's go ahead and go forward to the next slide, please. So I mentioned that lead agencies all have the responsibility to make their own decisions with respect to implementing 743. These are the broad categories of decisions, and we want to give you a bit of a framework for how to think about them. And I'll start with noting the technical advisory that OPR put together on evaluating transportation impacts in CEQA. That document cover is shown here on the right. OPR did a good job of trying to structure this particular technical advisory around the fundamental implementation questions that lead agencies need to make as they shift from vehicle level service to vehicle miles of travel as the primary metric for evaluating impacts. And so when you think about that shift to a new metric, the key questions become, what is the methodology for performing VMT analysis? And that includes very specific questions about what VMT metric are you going to use, whether or not you're going to employ screening techniques to streamline the review of projects, and what specific model or tool are you going to use to forecast VMT. Those are all independent decisions that the lead agencies are responsible for. OPR in this document also provides guidance on thresholds, and thresholds do apply for both project and cumulative analysis. The way that OPR structured this document is a very strong focus on helping to screen projects out of having to do VMT analysis. If you think about the legislative intent that SB 743 has, it really is trying to balance multiple objectives. The legislative intent is part of the statute that explains what was the legislature thinking when they put this together. And they've indicated that they were trying to achieve multiple objectives. They want to encourage infill housing, they want to promote active transportation for public health, and they want to reduce greenhouse gases. Now they want to do all that within the CEQA context, which we have to remember is a context in which there can be litigation. And so we want to be mindful of the advice that is in this particular document and balance that with the expectations that come with CEQA, and that when we provide analysis, we have to have substantial evidence supporting all the decisions that we make and supporting our analysis conclusions. So when we get into the thresholds, OPR's provided some guidance in this screening-based process, but there's not a lot of information in here for agencies if a project fails screening and needs to do a complete analysis. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as we get through the presentation. And then finally, what is feasible mitigation? That is something that each lead agency has to decide for themselves. And again, they need to think about the substantial evidence that would support a determination of what is feasible in their particular jurisdiction. Not all cities and counties share the exact same set of community values. They may differ on certain aspects of what they would define as feasible, and CEQA allows for that kind of discretion at the lead agency level. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned that CEQA does have this litigation component, and so one of the things we want to pay attention to as we try to provide information and guidance is exactly what the CEQA guidelines tell us about the expectations for impact analysis, especially any references that are commonly used by the courts. And these are some of the most commonly cited sections with respect to technical analysis. And I've highlighted a few of the key phrases here: fullest possible protection of the environment, full disclosure, adequately investigated, best efforts to find out and disclose. And then one of the more difficult ones is intelligently takes account of environmental consequences. We could probably debate that one for some time. But the main message here is that the expectations are high, especially when you see phrases such as best efforts to find out and disclose impacts. And so we want to keep that in mind as we think about the recommendations for the decision-making process that lead agencies need to go through here to make their choices around implementation. Next slide. So let's start off with what is VMT. This is one of my favorite slides, and despite it being blank right now, we're going to pull up a couple pictures. Here's the first one. When you go back, thank you, Anu. When you think about VMT, in some respects, it's a very simple metric because it's only made up of two parts: number of vehicle trips multiplied by the trip lengths. And here's an example. In the purple neighborhood, we have a grocery store, and you could calculate the grocery store's project generated VMT by just adding up those trips and multiplying them by their trip lengths. And that tells you part of the story on VMT. But there's another part of the story that's just as important, but you won't find much information about it in the technical advisory, but it could be very important to your local decision making. It's what we call the project effect on VMT. So let's presume that the gray neighborhood on the right here gets a proposal for a new grocery store. Next slide, or the next click. So there's a little grocery store coming into the gray neighborhood. You'll notice that that neighborhood didn't have the grocery store before and was still making all of these trips just over into the purple neighborhood. So the project effect on VMT here is not, if we measure it across the entire community, the same 3 trips are being made, they're just now much shorter. So you can have a project that does generate trips here on this isolated basis, but the project effect is to benefit the overall neighborhood and lower VMT levels. Both parts of the equation are really important to explain to decision makers and the public when we consider projects. And so we want to make sure that as we think about these types of calculations, we also understand how they're going to get used in our environmental analysis. Next slide. Before we had 743, we still had VMT. It was just an input to other impact analysis sections such as air quality, AQ, greenhouse gases, and energy. And in those 3 sections, we typically tried really hard to account for all the VMT generated by a project. And we typically measured the project effect on VMT by measuring the VMT across the network with and without the project. Under SB 743 and the technical advisory recommended by OPR, they've isolated certain types of VMT. For example, for residential project, they've recommended analyzing home-based work and home-based other trips. We call that home-based VMT. And for an office project, just isolating home-based work VMT. Focusing just on those components or parts of total VMT is appropriate when we're analyzing or screening projects. So if you think about the screening process, usually what you're doing is providing just enough information to support a presumption that a project would have a less than significant impact. And in this case, using those particular forms of VMT does that effectively. But for the projects that fail screening, you are left with the question, what to do next? Typically, that is to produce a complete analysis. And a complete analysis would typically include all the VMT generated by the project, not leaving any pieces or parts out, similar to what's done in the other sections. One of the things we've heard from CEQA attorneys reviewing our work is they don't necessarily want to see VMT show up in 4 different sections of an environmental document and it be a different number in one of the sections without a clear explanation as to why. So something to be mindful of with respect to setting expectations for VMT analysis, whether it's the methodology or whether it's thresholds. Recognize that we do analyze VMT today in at least 3 other sections, and there may be an expectation for consistency across the sections from reviewers. Let's go to the next slide. We also want people to understand a little bit more about all the different ways we might analyze VMT. A couple of different options, and I don't have time to go through all the different examples, but here's a couple that are mindful just to help make this transition from VMT as an input to air quality and greenhouse gases to VMT that we're analyzing for SB 743 purposes. When we first started focusing on VMT as an input was really for things like air quality analysis or air pollutants. And in those types of studies, we typically were worried about the VMT and the fuel consumption and emissions that were occurring directly proportionate to the population. And so we would do network-based VMT, typically within the boundary, maybe an air district boundary or a city limit boundary, such as the image here on the left. With 743, we're focused on something a little different. We want a full accounting of the VMT generated by projects. We call that the origin destination method, where any trip that has a stop in the jurisdiction is counted for VMT purposes. And we can map it so you can see where those trips are going to and from. And this is a little bit different. Not that there's one reason that makes one of these VMT methods any better than another. They have different purposes. But you'll see VMT being tossed around in documents and in guidance material, sometimes without these definitions attached to them. So it's really important to understand these definitions. I'll give you one more example. Next slide. So when we talk about VMT, we want to be very precise with our language. Here's 3 different examples. The one on the left is something we call household generated VMT per resident. What this is doing is keeping track of someone's travel throughout the day and tying it back to their home location. So in this example, presume we have one person living in this household. They go to the coffee shop in the morning, then to work, then they return. They go out a little bit later to get gas, buy some groceries, and return home. So we've accounted for all the travel throughout the day for this person, and it's 29 miles. So that can be 29 miles per capita or per resident. And that's a metric we commonly use in activity-based models. In trip-based models like OCTAM, we tend to focus on home-based generated VMT per resident. And you can see we're missing a couple of the trips when we do that. Home-based VMT is largely focused on trips that go to or from the home because the models don't keep track of what we call the full tour. Once they leave the home, we only know their next destination. We don't know what happens after that. So this is a different number. You'll see in miles at 16. So depending on how you define the VMT metric can have a big difference in what amount of VMT you might be reporting. And then when you simplify all the way down to home-based work generated VMT per employee, that's only trips that go directly to and from the home. And in that case, you've got another lower level of VMT here because it's just one particular trip. So when we talk about decisions about VMT methodology, picking the metric is oftentimes tied directly to the model. Household generated VMT is only available for activity-based models, whereas the home-based and home-based work VMT is something we can produce out of trip-based models and is most commonly used for those models. Let's go to the next slide. So once we get through understanding some of the methodology questions, you inevitably come to one of the more difficult questions in 743, and that's establishing VMT thresholds. What makes it so difficult is that you're trying to assess what is an acceptable level of VMT change caused by a project and what is unacceptable, and you're disconnecting it to some degree from the traditional reasons we analyze VMT, air pollutants and greenhouse gases and energy consumption. And you're trying to look through the lens of 743, which had those objectives to reduce greenhouse gases, but also encourage infill development and to promote active transportation. Well, what level of VMT change does that or doesn't do it? Gets to this fundamental question. Now, lead agencies do have discretion to set their own thresholds. They can do that on a project-by-project basis, or they can adopt them as part of a general set of standards, and that can be done by a public process that involves adopting a resolution or ordinance. And there's a role that other agencies may play in that, OPR, ARB, and Caltrans in particular. So the OPR technical advisory does contain recommendations for thresholds. OPR asked ARB to help them in evaluating their original threshold recommendations. So ARB has weighed in on what are some appropriate thresholds based largely on greenhouse gas reduction goals for the state. And then Caltrans, as owner and operator of the state highway system, can also set expectations for thresholds. And if you think about any project that might come forward in an urban area, it's very likely that Caltrans facilities will be used by trips from that project. And so they can set their own expectations for thresholds, and those need to typically be respected. Past practice has been to respect Caltrans level service thresholds when we have project trips on the state highway system. That expectation may carry over for VMT as well. So far, Caltrans in their draft guidance has recommended using the OPR thresholds in the technical advisory. So when we start to think about this for individual agencies, though, it's not always clear that they would share the same expectations that the state has. And that's where we start to see some of these differences in opinion and differences in potential evidence for what is acceptable versus unacceptable VMT when you're looking solely through this transportation lens. I think it's also important to realize, because we are analyzing VMT as part of the inputs to air quality and greenhouse gases as well as energy, there needs to be an alignment in expectations such that you don't have one particular section being inconsistent with the expectations in another section. So alignment is something that lead agencies need to be thinking about. Let's go to the next slide. Now, with these threshold decisions, some of the things that lead agencies have to be thinking about include the advice that comes to us through the statute language for 743, plus the CEQA guidelines changes that have been made, as well as the technical advisory, and ultimately the courts. One of the challenges with CEQA is when we make changes to it, and when I say make changes, that means to the guidelines and the statute, there's going to be debate as to what exactly technical practice needs to do to comply. And oftentimes those get settled in the courts, and it can take 5 to 10 years after a change is made before we start to see some of the more significant court decisions. But I've mentioned some of the criteria that the statute contains. It's highlighted in the blue here, and the bottom text here is from the CEQA guidelines. What got added to the CEQA guidelines as part of this update are really only two thresholds. One that says that projects generally within a half mile of an existing major transit stop or along an existing high quality transit corridor should be presumed to cause a less than significant impact. It doesn't say shall, it's a should, but that's one potential threshold. Locating projects in what is also called a transit priority area, that's the general definition for this, can be presumed to have a less than significant impact. Projects that decrease VMT can also be presumed to have a less than significant impact. All the other threshold advice that is in the technical advisory from OPR doesn't have the same legal weight as these two. So it's an important distinction to understand between how the CEQA guidelines are used in these court decisions versus technical advisories. Ultimately, all decisions in CEQA get judged based on substantial evidence to support the decisions or the analysis. So we want to start here, though, and then understand what additional agency evidence may exist to support their decisions. Let's go next slide. So when we think about the discretion and the substantial evidence that exists, we can start at any number of different levels, state level, regional levels. One thing that's commonly looked to, though, are regional transportation plans, sustainable community strategies, and the modeling that's done for those. So there's information in the new SCAG Connect SoCal RTP SCS about VMT and VMT generation for different parts of the region. And one of the threshold recommendations that OPR makes is that you should compare your projects to citywide or region-wide thresholds. Well, if you're using a region-wide threshold, it typically requires that you use a region-wide model that's capable of producing that value. So we have to be mindful of that connection between our thresholds and the model that's being used to set them, because that will also be the model that's required to be used when you are doing project analysis. One of the things that I want to point out about this slide, and looking specifically at the daily VMT per capita information here, depending on what county you're in, the VMT per capita is moving around between the base year 2016 and the future year 2045. When MPOs are preparing the RTPs and SESs in their models, they're working with a variety of inputs and parameters. They're oftentimes governed by things like the Clean Air Act or by SB 375, which gave us SESs. And one of the things that we've learned through that process is there's a lot of latitude that the MPOs have about what those input values are. And sometimes those input values may not always line up with the expectations for CEQA, which is more evidence-based. Let's go to the next slide. To make this a very clear example of what I mean when I point that out, is this graph on the left comes to us from ARB's SB 150 report. This is a report they were required to perform to evaluate how the SB 375 SESs were performing. On this slide, you see that VMT per capita and CO2 per capita since about 2011 has been increasing statewide. Now that was despite the MPO models and forecasts stating that they would be meeting the greenhouse gas targets that they were given, which are the green dots on this graphic. And so despite the MPO models indicating that they had a plan and they forecasted the effects of that plan and that they anticipated hitting the green dots, reality and the evidence is something different. And so this is what we have to think about in CEQA. We have to look to the evidence. So relying on those regional models off the shelf may be a challenge in trying to use them for purposes of setting threshold expectations, because the future year forecasts themselves have become a little bit disconnected from the anticipated performance. Now with COVID-19 effects in place, we're also disconnected from what's happening between models and real world conditions. So this will be an ongoing challenge for us. In terms of the slide picture here on the right, this is additional work that ARB did to evaluate how much additional VMT reduction is really necessary from land use development projects to achieve statewide goals by 2050. And this takes into consideration what's been happening with the background increases in VMT. And they came up with a 16.8% reduction in automobile, that means passenger cars and light trucks, VMT reduction between an average of measured between 2016 and 2018 out to 2050. Now this relies on a number of assumptions. This was also based on the 2050 population projections prior to the recent updates made by the Department of Finance. DOF did decrease statewide population projections by about 5 million. So we would expect this percentage to come down because of that. The point here is that that single percentage is not something that's going to be fixed in time. The OPR 15% VMT reduction recommendation is also not something that's fixed in time. these percentages will likely fluctuate with background conditions about travel. As travel goes up, VMT per capita goes up like it did over the last few years, or if it goes down because of COVID-19 effects, these are not fixed values. They are values that will change over time, and OPR and ARB would be expected to update these as new information comes in. Let's go to the next slide. The other substantial evidence that's important to consider that's not built into many of the travel forecasting models are trends that are difficult to forecast. Things like autonomous vehicle effects. Autonomous vehicles are now operating on different parts of the network in test mode. And in some states, they're actually operating in revenue service. We may see more of that in the future, especially with COVID-19 effects in place. But the modeling that's been done on this so far has showed that if we lower the cost of using vehicles because we no longer have to spend time driving them, and we no longer have to park them, and they drop us off door to door, it's possible that we'll see much higher levels of VMT than the models that are being used in practice today currently reveal. This is evidence, and there's a variety of research papers on the subject. This is just one example that we've put together from a TRB paper last year. So if you are trying to consider making threshold recommendations and even making impact findings, we have to consider this type of evidence. Let's go to the next slide. And then when you're making threshold decisions, part of that decision-making process is also whether or not you're going to take advantage of screening. As I mentioned earlier, screening is a way of doing some level of partial analysis to provide enough evidence to support a conclusion that a project is likely to have a less than significant impact. And what OPR has created so far are a number of different screening steps that you can follow. Is the project located in a transit priority area? Is the project located in a low VMT generating area? Meaning you've done some analysis and you've mapped out the parts of your city or your county that are lower than your threshold today. Those are low VMT areas. Is the project a local serving retail project less than 50,000 square feet? That's another screening option that OPR has created. And to show you how this would work in practice, let's go to the next slide. You can map your TPA screening areas. So these are based off definitions of high quality transit corridor stops or major transit stops directly in the CEQA statute language. So you can look those up. This is generally what it looks like. It's a half-mile buffer around these high quality stations. We have a local example in the next slide to show you what this looks like. This is Santa Ana. And you can see that with their high quality transit bus stops plus the Metrolink station, that a vast majority of the city potentially could be qualified for screening. So projects located in these areas, if they're of a similar land use type or they're complementary to the land uses that are already there, you could presume would have a less than significant impact on VMT. And this type of screening is what OPR was trying to achieve in balancing the objectives that they were given in the legislative intent. The idea to encourage infill housing. Well, this is one way to encourage it is by recognizing that development located in these areas tends to be of an infill nature. In those infill locations, you also tend to have a higher possibility of making walk or bicycle trips because destinations tend to be closer together. So this can be a very fast process without a lot of analysis, and we found a lot of interest in communities up and down the state of taking advantage of the screening. One more example of this is the low VMT area screening. Again, another example from Santa Ana. You can see based on this additional mapping, the areas that would be low VMT generating area or covered by the TPA. There's very little area left in the city where VMT impact analysis may be required. So this can really streamline development review for those cities that have similar circumstances. Now that leads us to the final set of decisions, feasible mitigation. So what is feasible? Well, again, this is for every lead agency to decide for themselves. but it needs to be based on substantial evidence. And so there's a few things that we think are important for pointing out key issues regarding mitigation. Generally, when you're trying to mitigate VMT, there's two types of mitigation that have traditionally been relied on. And those are pretty well documented in the CAPCOA Quantifying Greenhouse Gas Mitigation Measures document. They fall into these two categories. One I'm going to call built environment changes, or something we call the Ds. These are changing land use, such as density, diversity of uses. The others are transportation demand management strategies, or TDM. And one of the things regarding built environment changes that we've run into in practice is that physically changing a project is not always popular with the applicant. There may be some serious limitations on the ability of a lead agency to change the project. And so we have to work within that limitation. And a real challenge with TDM is that the effectiveness depends on the project site context and the future tenants and how they behave or perform. Those are things that we can't predict reasonably. If you look at the literature on TDM effectiveness, it's usually reported as a range, and the range starts at 0. So when you have a range of effect that's 0 to, say, a 3% reduction, what that tells you is to be certain that the mitigation will be effective, it requires monitoring. And you'll have to monitor until you have enough evidence that the impact has been reduced to less than significant. That could take many, many years. So what do we do differently if we're very limited on these types of mitigation measures? Well, one option is to look for different approaches. So next slide. There is plenty of new research coming in on VMT reduction strategies, so we're always trying to keep up on that. And we're trying to do a better job of understanding what is really project mitigation versus community mitigation, and what we're strategies that are most effective at the community or even regional level. So we've started to take and categorize our VMT mitigation strategies into these different levels, and that leads us to really what our program-based approach is. And program-based approaches, there's 3 basic types. We can go to the next slide. One is to identify these larger projects, completing bicycle and pedestrian networks and transit projects that can fall into traditional impact fee program structures. And we have one example from the city of LA of a VMT-based impact fee. So instead of using level of service as the nexus, we're using VMT reduction as the nexus that allows you to qualify into the capital improvement program a number of different bicycle, pedestrian, and transit projects. But we've also been doing a lot of work on the feasibility of what are a new concept called mitigation banks or mitigation exchanges. There's a white paper available for those that are interested from UC Berkeley on the general concept, and then one we've done for WRCOG about what it would take to actually implement one of these types of programs and the pros and cons of different program structures. And the idea here is to at a more aggregate scale than a project site, and using the framework of an exchange or bank to largely match up VMT generators with projects or sponsors of VMT reducing projects. So we'll see a lot more work on that subject to come in the future. With that is the very broad overview, covering a lot of material here, I know, in a very short period of time. There'll be much more documentation as part of what we're producing here for OCTA, though, to help you with this decision making. So with that, Anoop, I'll turn it back to you for Q&A.
Okay, I don't see any questions at this point. I'll wait a little bit, and then if I do see some questions, I will let you know. So we can actually, why don't we do this? Well, given that we don't have any questions, well,
Anoop, we have one question.
Yeah. Oh, I see him now. Okay. Do you have a link? Okay, well, now they're right here. Do you have a link to CARB's input on the OPR thresholds?
This has been.
Oh, you already answered.
Yes. So there's another one regarding the half mile for TPA.
Okay, in regards to the project is within a half mile of an existing or planned major transit stop or an existing stop along a high quality transit corridor, where is the half mile calculated, i.e. from the property line, center of project, door-to-door boundary, and then conduct a walk shed analysis?
Yeah, this is a fun question because there's not those kinds of technical details in the CEQA statute or guidelines. So far, most entities have looked at measuring from kind of the quote center of the station, a true half-mile radius as the crow flies. But these are, I think, questions that each lead agency can answer for themselves based on the evidence. If they wanted to use an actual walk network to be more refined with respect to the definition, that would be within their discretion. One other issue that we've run into with this definition is the 15-minute headways. That's one of the requirements to qualify bus lines for a TPA. And people have asked, is that based on schedules or is that based on actually observed arrival times? Because there's a difference. And we've been doing some testing and we're finding typically that 15-minute headways oftentimes means something closer to 20 minutes on actual arrivals, depending on the level of congestion in peak periods in the community. So again, CEQA is something that can be litigated over. And so those kinds of decisions typically come down to substantial evidence. And if the evidence is that service is not occurring on 15-minute headways, you have to think about how to incorporate that into your decisions about what qualifies.
Okay, there's a question about, and one or two more questions, just given the time. Does 743 apply to roadway projects, e.g. highway widening, hot lanes, ramp metering, etc.?
Yeah, so there's a section it's section 15064.3 of the CEQA guidelines. That's the new section that got added for SB 743 purposes. And it addresses both land use and transportation projects. For transportation projects, lead agencies may use VMT, but are not required to. And to the extent that they choose to use it, it does allow screening out a lot of projects such as bicycle, pedestrian, and some transit projects, whereas the types of projects that would likely have significant impacts would tend to be the roadway capacity expansion projects because of their induced travel effects. One of the obvious questions we also get under this topic is whether or not agencies can continue to use level service. And that's a question, it's a fun question for your CEQA attorneys. I'll share what we've heard from those attorneys, is that it would be very difficult to use level of service given the language in 15064.3 and the new language that got added in 15064.7. That's a section related to setting thresholds. The way that the two sections work is that in one section, it basically says if you're going to pick a different metric, it needs to be consistent with CEQA. Well, CEQA in other sections says that you shouldn't be using level of service anymore. And then there's another part that says whatever metric you're picking needs to demonstrate that it's protective of the environment. And OPR has spent a lot of time demonstrating how level of service is not protective of the environment. In fact, it creates harmful environmental outcomes. So the weight of evidence for people to continue using level of service doesn't seem to be there. It seems to push you in either use VMT or find a different metric that is more compatible or consistent with CEQA.
Okay, we have a bunch more questions. Either we'll get to them at the end or we will answer them at another point after the presentation and email them off to folks. So I'm going to move on. Thank you, Ron, for your presentation. And like I said, I'd like to shift to the second topic, which is OCTA's approach to prepare for this change. And I'll be kind of doing a quick introduction. I think I'm going to speed it up a bit more, given the time. And then Brian Smolke, our chief modeler, will kind of give the rest of the technical presentation. So again, you all, I'll skip this a little bit, but most of the participants in this workshop already know the variety of roles and responsibility OCTA has with public transportation, transit service, countywide transportation, et cetera. I do want to but for this presentation, I wanted to note the last bullet. OCTA develops and maintains the Orange County traffic analysis model and the role that OCTAM and the role that this plays in 743. So I know Fair and Peers covered this a little bit, but I wanted to emphasize that while VMT will not be considered an environmental impact under CEQA, LOS, I think there's somebody might have, I don't know, somebody might want to mute their line. I'm hearing something. Okay, thank you. So LOS still has a role to play for OCTA through the congestion management program and for local agencies through their own needs. And I wanted to also highlight some recent efforts that we've been doing with respect to 743. So in 2019, OCTA, with the help of Cambridge Systematics, went through a process to update OCTAM primarily to include a VMT reporting tool by select geography, which was completed at the end of 2019. After this OCTAM update, in early 2020, we reached out to stakeholders, including local agencies and transportation consultants, about the VMT tool, provided the OCTAM model stream with this new VMT tool, and/or provided OCTAM VMT output as requested. Currently, with the help of Fair and Peers, we are adding some additional VMT-related features to OCTAM to better meet California requirements. And we're also determining how OCTAM needs to be updated to evaluate transportation projects. So with that, I kind of want to turn it over to Brian, and let's see if this can find him. So Brian, are you on?
I'm on.
Okay, I'll turn it over to you right now, and you can kind of go over the technical OCTAM overview.
Thank you, Anoop. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Anoop said, I'll be going over some of the technical details of OCTA's new SB 743 related VMT tool. So since the VMT tool is integrated directly into OCTAM, I'm going to start out with a little bit of a review of OCTAM itself. OCTAM is a traditional trip-based travel demand model that incorporates feedback. Although it has its own user interface, it runs fully within the Transcat software environment. New versions of OCTAM typically correspond to new versions of the underlying demographic data. The current version is OCTAM 5.0. This was adopted for use in December of 2019. It uses demographic data from the Orange County Projections 2018, which is developed by the Center for Demographic Research in the Cal State Fullerton. It has a base year of 2016 and a future year of 2045. And as Anoop previously said, it incorporates the new VMT tool. Next slide. Okay, this just shows what the user interface looks like. The big menu on the left is the main OCTAM dialog box. It includes the tools basically to run OCTAM itself, along with a handful of other utilities. The smaller menu to the right shows the various model scenarios that allows you to select and edit the scenario. Next slide. So to review something that Ron went over earlier, there could be considered to be two different major types of VMT. There is a boundary VMT, which includes all VMT within a certain geography, regardless of where that the trip started or ended. The second one is called generated VMT, which can also sometimes be called OD VMT. This VMT is all of VMT that's created by trips that start or end within a certain geography. Like say, for example, you're looking at Orange County. The trip that starts and ends in Orange County, or a trip that starts in Orange County and ends in LA County, the entire VMT of both those trips will be included in a generated VMT. But meanwhile, if you have a trip that starts in Riverside, passes through Orange County, and ends in Los Angeles, none of that VMT will be included under generated VMT. OCTAM has historically only calculated that boundary VMT. So in order to anticipate the requirements of the SB 743, we added a new tool with help from Cambridge Systematics that will calculate the generated VMT. So besides calculating the total generated VMT, it also includes few statistics as recommended under the OPR guidelines, including residential VMT per capita and the employment or commute VMT per employee. Next slide. So trips in OCTAM are categorized into 6 different major purposes. Each trip also has a production and an attraction associated with it. This information is basically used to define whether or not a trip would be categorized under the residential VMT or the employment VMT. So if a trip has a production at a home, it's considered to be part of residential VMT. And if it has a production at home and attraction at the work, it's considered part of the commute VMT. Next slide. So as requested, OCTA has been providing VMT data to local agencies as requested. So we've either been providing output from the VMT tool itself, or we've been providing the VMT tool as part of the overall OCTAM model stream. This slide shows some of the standard VMT output by the tool that we've been providing. This is the data for Orange County. Thus far, 23 jurisdictions throughout Orange County have requested VMT data from OCTA. Typically, when I provide the data to jurisdictions, we provide some notes on that data. I'd like to focus on those right now. So I guess first of all, the OCTAM tool, the VMT tool, you're able to select the different geographies to analyze, but the geographies must nest into OCTAM traffic analysis zones. The OCTAM zones are developed to be appropriate for regional modeling purposes, but they don't always exactly follow jurisdictional boundaries. So it's possible that a zone may straddle 2 different cities. In that case, we typically will choose which city seems more appropriate. And sometimes those cities have been requesting different definitions of how their cities are defined with TAZs. As a next note, SB 743 generally requests to use all VMT generated by a project. The VMT tool currently does not account for VMT that occurs outside of the OCTAM model area. We anticipate this percentage would be relatively small because OCTAM includes a pretty wide area outside of Orange County. Includes all of Los Angeles and big chunks of the Inland Empire. However, for trips that do not leave the OCTAM model area, including those that go to San Diego or distant parts of California, that would not be included in this VMT numbers that we're providing. We are currently working with parent peers to address this issue. And then finally, updates to OCTAM will result in changes to the VMT results. When we incorporate new demographic data or if we change some of the modeling parameters, the results will change. Next slide. So while OCTA is helping local agencies with the VMT data, local agencies will still be expected to perform certain decisions on their own. And so local agencies will still need to develop their own screening criteria and thresholds. Figure that local agencies typically are the lead agencies for projects, and they know their jurisdictions the best. And second, we're expecting that similar to how things are done today, local agencies or their designated consultants will still be responsible for performing that project level analysis on their own. So OCTA will still provide OCTAM if they are requested for these type of projects though. Next slide. So next steps. OCTA plans to continue providing local agencies with the help regarding the VMT data for screening purposes. And we are currently working with FAIR and peers to add a few new features to the OCTAM VMT tool. One of these new features that was mentioned before, hoping to better account for VMT that leaves the whole OCTAM region. And next, it has come to OCTA's attention that there are a couple of different philosophies regarding the estimating generated VMT. Differences between these approaches are relatively subtle and technical in nature. One of them involves using origin destination data mixed with the production and traction data to calculate the generated VMT. And the second approach relies only using production and traction data. OCTA feels that both approaches are justifiable and that some certain cities seem to have a preference for one over the other. Therefore, in order to accommodate both of these preferences, we will be updating the VMT tool to be able to produce results for using either approach. So we will not be doing questions and answers right now, but if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And I think we're going to move on to the local agency update, and we'll start with Sun Murillo from Irvine with a City of Irvine update. And let's just double check if Sunset, are you on the line?
Yes.
Ah, excellent. Just let me know.
Okay. So the City of Irvine's approach to address VMT analysis is what we plan to do is we plan to maintain the level of service analysis consistent with our current practice. So a development project will be required to do LS analysis similar to how it's done now. However, we are going to incorporate VMT in a new section of that traffic study guideline that will be adopted by the City Council. The VMT analysis and the threshold goal adoption that we expect to occur is based on the city's traffic model. We call it the ITAM TransCAD 2018 VMT, which is basically a sub-regional model of OCTAM. And that's used to establish the VMT significance threshold goals, and it also will be used to evaluate each project's VMT rate to identify potential impacts. Next slide. One back. There you go. We are proposing a tier 1 screening in which if a project, an applicant provides sufficient justification that any one of these tier 1 criteria can be met with the proposed project, that further VMT impact analysis would not be required. These tiers screening devices are basically consistent with OPR recommendation. Next slide. We are proposing a 15% reduction of existing VMT rates with that existing VMT baseline of 2018, consistent with OCTAM. Next slide. We are proposing 2 significance threshold goals. We have a residential VMT per capita goal that will be applicable for residential use projects. We also proposing a non-residential VMT per employee threshold goal that would be applicable for office, industrial, hotel, large retail uses and the like. For a mixed use project that is submitted to the city for review that has both residential and non-residential components, we would use the VMT tool to evaluate the project both from a residential standpoint and a non-residential standpoint in order to identify impacts in either. Next slide. This slide, it represents in the existing column the existing or 2018 VMT rates based on our model, ITAM. And what we're proposing is a 15% reduction of those existing VMT rates. So 14.9 for residential rate and 41.5 for the non-residential. Next slide. Oh, wait, one back, keep that slide up real quick. The one thing to note that if you notice there's a discrepancy between the non-residential rate identified here and the non-residential rate that OCTA prepared or presented in their slides. And the key difference will be what I explain in the next slide. So the proposed methodology, it's all about trip types. What kind of trip types are included in that total VMT rate? So the numerator of the VMT rate is the total VMT, not total VMT, VMT residential, which on the left column represents all of the home-based work productions and home-based school, university, and other productions, any trip that starts at the home. And that rate is based on a countywide population. The non-residential VMT per employee, so in other words, the numerator in that VMT rate per employee is made up of all of the various attractions, home-based work, home-based school attractions. We also include the last 4 bullets of that non-residential category, work-based other productions and attractions, and other-based other productions and attractions. Basically, these are those non-residential uses and the VMT associated with the trips to and from that employment center to another retail site, other uses, and That's where the key difference is in our threshold number. It includes those types of trips versus OCTA's only commute-based. And again, that rate is the denominator of that rate is the countywide number of employees. The city's VMT tool, which is a trip-based travel demand model based on OCTAM, it does calculate the distance based on a congested roadway system. It applies that distance to each trip, and it categorizes, as I discussed, either in residential or non-residential VMT. Next slide. So what we found based on our extensive testing of various projects using our ITAM VMT tool is that project VMT is significantly influenced by project location, size, and land use mix. The projects are sensitive to access to transit, pedestrian connectivity, and ride-sharing opportunities, nearby job opportunities, school availability, and nearby recreational and shopping availability. Next slide. This slide represents essentially the flow chart that a project applicant can come into the city and understand what the process is. As you see to the left, that's the level of service analysis that is what we currently practice. And then there's to the right, the new VMT screening, first of which is the tier 1 screening, whether or not you have to do additional VMT analysis. And if sufficient justification is provided that you do meet one of these screening criteria, then no additional VMT analysis is required. However, if you answer no and you do have to do VMT analysis, that's where comes in our VMT rate thresholds. Essentially, we identify the project's VMT rate, whether it's residential or non-residential, and we compare that to the adopted threshold goal rate to determine if there's an impact. So the best way we thought as an example of this flow chart is through example. Next slide. So as this example, project A, it's a residential project. It proposes 600 dwelling units in a planning area. And the project applicant has provided sufficient justification that the project has prior entitlement and CEQA clearance documentation for those exact 600 units. The project contributes 3,000 ADT, and using our ITAM VMT tool, the project results in an increase of 48,000 residential VMT and an increase in population of 1,600 countywide. So tier 1 criteria, does the project meet any one of the criteria? Assuming sufficient justification is provided that there is appropriate CEQA clearance documentation, and when compared to the prior entitlement, the project does not result in a net increase of 250 daily trips, no further VMT analysis is required. One thing to note, the 250 daily trips, that is a little bit different than OPR's recommendation of 110, but we have provided as part of our VMT impact analysis a technical appendix, which we provide justification for all of our assumptions made. Next slide. Project B, so another example project. This is the 600 dwelling units in a planning area that has no prior entitlement, no CEQA clearance documentation whatsoever, and it contributes, if using the project dwelling unit and ITE trip generation, it generates 3,000 daily trips. Using our VMT tool, 58,000 VMT, increased population of 1,600. Does the project meet the tier 1 criteria screening? No. What we do then in tier 2 is we do the VMT impact analysis. We evaluate the total residential VMT, 48,000 divided by the change in population, 1,600. We result in a VMT rate for the project of 30, and we compare that to the VMT residential threshold rate of 14.9. We have an impact. Next slide. So then the mitigation that we would, the mitigation strategy that we would use is we would calculate the VMT, residential VMT mitigation, or sorry, the residential VMT mitigation percentage by evaluating the percentage of the proposed project's VMT rate difference between the threshold divided by the project's VMT rate. It comes out to be 50.3 mitigation percentage. What we are proposing is 2 mitigation strategies. A project potentially could apply a 2.5% reduction for on-site infrastructure to support pedestrian, bicycle connectivity, bike lockers, bike storage, various types of strategies on site to promote on-site connectivity related to pedestrian transit. We also are proposing potentially a 5% reduction of mitigation percentage for TDM, if that's applicable. In some instances, the city does have areas, for instance, in the Spectrum area, where a project may go in to a site where spectrum motion is required, that project must participate in spectrum motion, and that 5% would be applicable if a project had an impact. And again, we have a technical appendix to justify the reasons for our assumptions. So in this case, what you'll find as a result is that we can't mitigate this project. And that's why in the future, not in the near term, but hopefully at some point in the future, the city will be potentially adopting a VMT mitigation fee program. For this particular project, in which that doesn't exist, we would probably be proposing that the project prepare an EIR that requires the City Council adoption of a statement of overriding considerations. Next slide. And this last project example is a mixed-use project where the project is proposing dwelling units and a number of different types of non-residential uses. The assumption is that there is no prior entitlement or CEQA clearance documentation in an undeveloped area of the city. The project contributes 20,000 daily trips based on ITE. The project results in an increase of 45,000 residential VMT based on our ITAM VMT tool, and 55,000 non-residential VMT, which is including the 28,000 commute VMT as well as the 27,000 other VMT, including customer, client, and work-based other trips. The project results in a population increase of 3,000 employees and an increase of 1,500 population. So, Tier 1, does the project meet any criteria listed in Tier 1? No. Tier 2, VMT impact analysis. Calculate the residential VMT per capita, and that results in a value of 15. Compare that to the adopted threshold rate of 14.9. We find there's an impact. The non-residential component, based on the VMT model, evaluating the 55,000 and divided by the 1,500, we get 37 VMT per employee. Compare that to the adopted threshold rate of 41.68, and we find there's no impact for the non-residential component. So this project requires mitigation of the residential component of the project. Next slide. And that is calculated by same methodology, project minus the threshold divided by the project. We have a 0.7% VMT mitigation percentage. We then apply the 2.5% reduction of on-site infrastructure, assuming the project is completely consistent and supportive of on-site infrastructure that promotes transit, pedestrian, bicycle connectivity. And in this case, this project is adequately mitigated. Next slide. So our next steps are, we are planning to present our VMT methodology for Transportation Commission consideration and recommendation in May. May 5th is the Transportation Commission meeting that we're scheduled for, and then thereafter we are planning to go to Planning Commission and City Council in May and June, where we hope to, by July 1st, implement the VMT impact analysis as part of all projects that have not yet been approved. And that's all I have. Back to you, Anoop.
Thank you so much. Thanks. So next up we have Larry, and I have Larry Tay from the City of Orange, and I'm going to unmute him. Let's see. So give me a second. All right. I see he's unmuted. So Larry Tay, City of Orange.
Anoop, can you hear me?
Yes. Perfect.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It's always good to speak toward the end of the program, I guess, since everything's already been said. So rather than dive into the weeds with the modeling details that everybody's kind of touched on so comprehensively, I just wanted to share what we've done on a really high level. Mainly three things: our collaborative effort with the North Orange County cities, the relevant decisions that the City of Orange has made with respect to VMT implementation or 743 implementation, and a VMT screening and estimation tool that's currently being developed. Obviously, one of the biggest impediments for us as an agency going through this process was cost, and going through the implementation process alone was just prohibitive. So we asked a few of our neighbors if they wanted to benefit from that collaborative project, and given the looming compliance deadline, the cost and administrative efficiencies of a shared project, there seemed to be considerable interest. And in a departure from my high school days, everybody actually said yes, and we were able to build a team of 7 North Orange County cities referred to as the NOCC. And I will say that this model or this approach has been successfully undertaken in Western Riverside County and also a number of San Bernardino County cities as well. But immediately the benefits were clear. Our costs were cut by more than half. One of the concerns that I and many others had going into the joint effort was potential that cities could lack autonomy, that we may be forced to adopt thresholds at the area level rather than the city level, or be forced to compromise on some of the screening criteria that we wanted to adopt. That wasn't the case. In fact, the only thing we had to agree on collectively was that OCTA would be the VMT estimating tool. I don't think anybody would argue with that. And ultimately, we collectively decided to use VMT per service population as a metric. From that point on, each city made independent decisions, including those related to daily trip thresholds for project screening, defining local serving land uses within the community that could be considered for screening, establishing VMT benchmarks, and establishing VMT thresholds. So while all of our partner agencies have or are in the process of finalizing these very decisions along whatever lines best suits their goals, Orange has decided to screen projects that generate 110 trips or less per day, consistent with the OPR guidance. We've added assisted living and senior housing to the multitude of land use types that we consider to be local serving. Decided to benchmark ourselves rather than the county, and opted for a threshold of better than general plan build out rather than the 15% OPR. We felt that the 15% was a little bit too aggressive and serve as a impediment. Next slide. So each city has also got a customized screening map for transit priority and low VMT areas. Here's the one for Orange. You can see the shaded areas are the low VMT, and the area within the bubble, it represents our transit priority areas. As you can see, and to my pleasant surprise, a fair amount of our city lies within one of these two areas, which should help streamline a lot of the projects that we have to review. Next slide. One thing I really wanted to highlight was the VMT screening tool. It's still under development, but it's almost finished. But I just want to make everybody aware it's still a work in progress. So basically, it's an interactive tool, interactive spreadsheet that evaluates whether a proposed land use project in any of the 7 North Orange County cities could be screened from a full VMT analysis, and if not, whether it would likely generate VMT impacts, and if VMT impacts were generated, the tool can also be used to test different mitigation measure options and determine the mitigation potential of a combination of VMT reducing measures. It's pretty user friendly. You simply enter an APN at the upper left-hand corner of the spreadsheet, a land use mix, and the tool will define whether a project can be considered for screening based on it being in a TPA, low VMT area, being a low trip generator, or a local serving land use. In the lower right-hand corner, I guess the tool kind of just displays existing VMT, project generated VMT, and compares it to the selected thresholds. And you can kind of easily see whether or not there might be an impact. Next slide. Here's the other component of our screening tool. It takes the same project from the previous slide and contains options to apply 12 common categories of TDM reduction measures, half of which I apologize got cut off from the slide. But they include mitigation measures such as providing rideshare programs, implementing a car share program, improving pedestrian network, providing a bicycle network improvements. And the user can select a combination of TDM measures to see what the expected VMT reduction would be for a particular project. A couple things to keep in mind. This tool helps with screening. It provides kind of like that back of the envelope analysis for us to kind of quickly understand the project's VMT implications. But for the projects that don't screen out, it's not a substitute for the VMT analysis. And also projects that lie in more than one traffic analysis zone, this tool will not will not be able to work. Next slide. And just to wrap it up, the next steps for us, we're currently finalizing our TIA guidelines, which will incorporate our requirements for VMT analysis. We are, needless to say, retaining level of service to ensure general plan compliance. And we're scheduled to present our revised TIA CEQA guidelines and general plan amendments to our council in late June for approval. And that's it. Back to you, Anoop.
Thank you, Larry. And then next up on the docket is City of Anaheim, David Kennedy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, I can. Okay. All right. So my name is David Kennedy. I'm with the City of Anaheim with Public Works Traffic Engineering. And like Larry before me, I don't want to rehash a lot of the things that have already been said. So just going to keep it brief as far as what our approach has been and some of the things we've come across as we've gone through our process. So like the other cities, we are going to be keeping our ICU LOS analysis requirements as a consistency with our general plan. And we'll have it as a document that's referenced within our VMT guidelines. So the VMT guidelines will be the base document, and if enough trips are generated at a project or other criteria, then they would be required to do a level service analysis for general plan consistency. We will be using OCTAM as well for our VMT calculations. It makes it simple. We do have our own model, but it hasn't been updated to be able to do the VMT screening. That is something we'll be looking into in the future, but it isn't a decision we had to make now. We just wanted to focus on getting the implementation done for SB 743, and then other decisions that can be made later we would do as time permits when we potentially update our general plan, for example. Our screening criteria in general is consistent with the OPR technical advisory. We're not recommending any deviations to the screening criteria as presented in there. Next slide. So on this screen, we are going over what our thresholds will be. So we have a project level as well as a cumulative level, as discussed earlier. So our project level will be based on 15% below the Orange County baseline VMT per service population, and the cumulative impact will be an increase in the baseline or cumulative VMT comparing project to no project. Next slide. Our next steps, we're wrapping up our draft guideline review right now. We'll have that scheduled to go to Planning Commission to approve or recommend to City Council to approve the thresholds and guidelines on April 27th, and we're anticipating late May or early June for City Council. That date hasn't been scheduled yet, but we're giving ourselves a little bit of leeway in case something comes up so we can still meet the July 1st deadline. Next slide. So on these slides, I'm showing the VMT per service area map. The blue areas are 15% below the threshold. The yellow areas are between 0 and 15%, and then the red areas are above. Most of the low VMT areas are within our residential and urban core areas in Central and West Anaheim. And on the next slide, we have the transit priority area map. And we have pretty good coverage on the west and central parts of town as well. A lot of these areas do overlap with the VMT. One of the things that we discovered during this project is that when you look at the guidelines, the technical advisory study that OCR presented, that there are some restrictions in regards to the presumption of less than significance for transit stations. Specifically that it does say that projects should be presumed to be less than significant impact on VMT, but the presumption would apply only if the project would still not generate more than the VMT than would be expected near a transit corridor. And so this is something such as having a floor area ratio of less than 0.75 would not necessarily qualify for that type of screening. And 0.75 generally is a higher density level. It was in the spirit of the target, as I've been told, was based on having transit-oriented projects and transit priority corridors. So there's some gray area in there, and we decided to protect ourselves in that sense and have these maps separate, unlike Santa Ana, who combined them, just to make sure that that doesn't become an issue in the long run. So that's something that would have to be weighed in as you look at these screening things to consider that. The other thing I would like to, that we did in regards to the other screening criteria where you're looking at projects that can be excluded from screening based on having less than the 110 threshold or being locally serving retail, is that having a definition for locally serving retail can be a little difficult in some areas. And as we've already found out, what we as the city determined to be locally serving may be different than what the development community is assuming to be locally serving. So within our guidelines that we're putting together, we're listing the specific land uses that are outlined and defined in our Anaheim Municipal Code for non-residential uses, to make it clear that if you fall within these land uses as defined in our code, that you could be eligible to be screened based on your land use type of being locally serving retail. And that's all I have to offer. I'll be around for questions.
Thank you, David. And finally, we have Caltrans update with Scott Shelley. You there, Scott?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. I'll let you have the floor.
Wonderful, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Scott Shelley. I am the Local Development Intergovernmental Review Branch Chief for District 12 here in the Division of Planning and Local Assistance at District 12, and one of the focal points of contact for SB 743 here in the district. The primary focal point would be Smita Deshpande. She is our District SB 743 liaison, and she resides in the Division of Environmental Analysis. However, we are both available for inquiries and coordination for all the local agencies here in the county. As many of you are aware, Caltrans recently circulated for comment our TISG Transportation Impact Study Guide for review and comment, and we thank those that submitted comments and concerns. The comment period is currently closed for that document. However, Caltrans has released additional guidance in the form of the Implementation Timeline Memo and the draft TAF and draft TAC, that's the Transportation Analysis Framework document, and the Transportation Analysis under CEQA document. These documents can be found on our Caltrans SB 743 implementation website. Additionally, Caltrans will be scheduling a webinar that discusses the content of both the draft TAC and the draft TAF, and we're excited to hear your feedback, concerns, and questions. As I said before, both these documents are available online currently for an informal review, and those comments can be received up to the close of business on June 15th of this year. And there is also an electronic comment tool available on the website for your convenience. To clarify the roles that Smita and myself oversee as it relates to SB 743 for the district, I'm in charge of the local development review that is off system, and Smita works primarily with the transportation projects that are on system within the district. In general, Caltrans is eager and available to participate and coordinate with all the agencies and cities in Orange County in the pursuit of the interpretation and understanding of the guidance put out on SB 743, such as development of methodologies and thresholds and general questions. We're here as a partner. Feel free to reach out to us, and we are actively reaching out to each of you. Thank you, Anoop.
Thanks a lot, Scott. So we have a little bit of time for questions. So maybe what I'll do is look at some of the questions here and try to get to some of those first. I just want to, before I do that, I did want to thank all the participants. I want to thank Fair and Peers. I want to thank the cities, David Kennedy, Larry Tay, Sun, as well as Brian Smoky. So thank you so much. And then so let's get to the questions. One of the questions I think I see is information identifying that. Oops, it's moving. Information identifying that project level VMT mitigation will not be enough to reach thresholds. Is there any Orange County effort to look at countywide VMT mitigation approaches that individual developers could contribute to? Is this a concept under consideration by OCTA? I think with respect to that question, we are actively looking at different what other agencies are doing out there. Fair and Peers is kind of helping us with that review, seeing if there's a kind of some kind of mitigation bank or VMT bank that we could think about. I don't think it's likely given the difficulty of that task, but it's something that we have Fair and Peers looking at. And Ron, if you don't mind kind of chatting a little bit about kind of VMT banks, and do you see them actually happening, or is there going to be a high hurdle to get to that point?
Yeah, so if you think of the 3 program options, impact fees versus exchanges and banks, you could almost rank them in terms of level of difficulty, with banks at the high end, the most difficult, and impact fees and exchanges, somewhere being similar. So if you ever put together your own impact fee program, you would probably expect a similar level of effort in creating an exchange. The current status in terms of agencies that are very interested in trying to move the ball forward on this, WRCOG is definitely one of them. The white paper that we currently have out is being updated with a new governance section and a lot more details about how you go about creating a new program, especially a mitigation exchange. There's also Metro and City of LA have a pilot project that they're starting to evaluate for transit pass subsidies, and agencies like SACOG have submitted for Caltrans planning grants, as well as CCTA, Contra Costa Transportation Authority up in the Bay Area, to further explore the bank and exchange concepts. So there's a lot of activity around the concept, but you can't point to one that's exactly in place and you could copy it today. We've also started to evaluate one new idea around the banks that may be simpler to implement, so I may change my ranking later. And if you think about what's happening with the COVID-19 responses and how many public agencies have gone to telecommuting and how effective it's been, if in the future those agencies decide to make some of that telecommuting a little bit more permanent, let's say people that were coming to work every day, all 5 days of the week, now are telecommuting 1 day a week, reducing their work-related VMT by 20%, you could take that VMT reduction associated with your own telecommute program and bank it and allow future applicants, whether they're developers or transportation project sponsors, to purchase that VMT reduction as a credit. That could be a very simple form of a bank that would be easy to craft and document the level of reduction that the agencies are able to create. Maybe a new revenue generation idea that could also help out local agencies. So there's a lot happening in this space, and kind of stay tuned, because new ideas are coming about that could make this stuff even simpler to implement.
Okay, I think the rest of the question, just kind of looking at them, I'm trying to see if there's something that can be quickly. Here we go. This one, again, it's, I'm not sure if Ron already answered it, but Chris Flynn, Deputy Director, Environmental Analyst at D12, any projects that go through Caltrans, whether capital oversight or encroachment permit, that have the potential to add capacity should anticipate conducting VMT analysis. Oh, maybe it's just an answer, I'm not sure. But Ron, did you, or Ron or Scott, maybe?
I'll just add one quick thing. So yeah, this idea of adding capacity and subjecting it to VMT analysis, I think that the goal here is that to the extent that that added capacity does result in induced vehicle travel, meaning new VMT, there are certain capacity projects that probably won't be significant enough. Let's say adding a second left turn lane to an intersection. That adds capacity clearly, but probably not enough that it would induce any new VMT. But I get Chris's point here. They're going to be looking very carefully here at capacity expanding projects to verify whether or not they have the potential to cause that induced travel effect. And if they do, yeah, subjecting to the VMT analysis makes sense.
Okay, I think we're at the 2:30 mark. I do have all these questions. Kind of, we'll save them as a file and then answer them and send the answers back to everybody who participated. We have a recording that's going on that we will also try to share as best we can. And then I think the other thing is we'll definitely share the slides and the answers. So I do again want to thank everybody who's participated on the call. Thank you so much for participating. The panelists, the folks who called in, we had over 125 at one point attendees. So thank you very much. I think with that, I will kind of conclude the webinar, and we look forward to working on this 743 issue. If you do have additional questions that you didn't get into the question box, go ahead and email me, and we can definitely answer that. Anyway, so with that, I want to conclude the workshop, and I wanted to say that's it. Thank you.